Something happened here 50 years ago. Something so terrible and so devastating that 118 families' lives were forever changed. On the 18th of June 1972, 112 passengers and 6 crew boarded BEA Flight 548 due to travel to Brussels from Heathrow, just 6 miles to the north of here. Among those on board were leaders of industry, women and men preparing to usher in a new era of European cooperation at a pivotal time for Britain. Sadly, all lives were lost when the plane crashed here in the town of Staines, in what till this day remains the deadliest accidental aviation disaster in the history of Britain. But what caused the plane to crash? What was it like for the emergency first responders? And who were the 118? I hope you can join me on this journey of fact-finding, to shed light on what happened here all those years ago, and of course, honour and remember the dead.
We got this other call that came out saying there was possibly a light aircraft that had crashed in Staines near the gasometer.
The roads were absolutely gridlocked, and it was so bad we actually had to get out of the ambulance and ask people to move their cars.
And then suddenly the phone rings. You've got to get on duty. There's been a plane crash.
It was coming towards the end of our shift, and then we got this call to go to the Staines bypass, aircraft crash.
320.
There was radio traffic communications. We were then told it wasn't a light aircraft, it was possibly a passenger aircraft.
And the message came through quite quickly from the incident managers that there was nobody left who was alive.
But we'd done our utmost with dignity. You know, it was a bad afternoon.
But you could see the devastation. You could feel it in all of us. All those poor souls dead.
And it was quite tragic to think that so many people lost their life.
The droop is part of the wing that extends down to increase the space of the wing, therefore increasing lift. If they're retracted too soon, it doesn't provide enough lift and the aircraft can head into a stall.
Some very strong lessons came out of the accident, particularly the voice recorders and the interrelationship between members of the crew. It's gone on into the health system and even into nuclear power stations.
From the reports of that time there's a lot of finger pointing as to what the cause of the accident was, and that's not the point of aviation investigation. It's all about safety and trying to learn lessons for the future.
Have you heard about the 1972 Trident air crash?
Yes, I have. No.
No, it's news to me. Never heard about it before.
Not yet, but I'm willing to find out. I know nothing about it.
The Papua India crash happened here in the town of Staines, which is just outside and to the southwest of London. Here's the actual crash site and the location of the memorial. But why is this horrific accident not more well known in the town where it happened? This event is sadly overshadowed by another disaster that happened 16 years later. In 1988, 243 passengers, 16 crew and 11 residents lost their lives when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded in mid-air and crashed onto a residential area in the Scottish town of Lockerbie in what was a cowardly act of terrorism. But the Papua India disaster was entirely accidental and may have been avoided. So what caused the plane to crash just 2 minutes after takeoff? And what did it mean for the aviation industry?
There are 4 factors behind an aircraft flying successfully: lift, thrust, weight and drag. Thrust from the engines, lift from the wings, weight of the body of the aircraft and the drag produced by the aircraft trying to get off airborne. To enable an aircraft to fly, you have on the wing, or aerofoil, devices at the front and rear of the wing. On the front, they're either called leading edge slats or droops. The droop is a part of the wing that extends down to increase the space of the wing, therefore increasing lift. If they're retracted too soon, it doesn't provide enough lift and the aircraft can head into a stall. The aircraft was a London to Brussels flight, 112 passengers and 6 crew on board. Normal conditions for flying, a bit turbulent, but nothing outside the aircraft capacity. Unfortunately, they didn't achieve the right speed to maintain their climb. They were 60 knots too slow, and at the same time the droops were retracted, therefore increasing the weight of the aircraft to a point where it could not recover from a stall. All life was lost. Lots of things were changed within aviation. At the time, the flight data recorder was not a legal requirement, and nor was it required to withstand an impact. Luckily on this occasion it did withstand the impact, and they had it in situ. I think there's lots of lessons that have been learnt from it. If you read the actual report, it's very aged and very dated, and there's lots of, as I've said previously, lots of finger pointing, which isn't good. There also seems to be lots of assumptions and presumptions about actions of the crew, and without things like the cockpit voice recorder or the flight data recorder, that's a bit unfair on the crew at the time. It's hard to say whether, if there were no noise abatement rules at the time, the aircraft incident would have still occurred. Quite possibly, because they still weren't going fast enough for the speed and they still retracted the droops too soon. Noise abatement generally doesn't affect takeoff performance of an aircraft. I think there are 2 things to consider regarding Captain Key's physical condition. One is, was he physically fit to fly at the time? If you use the legislation at the time, yes, he was physically fit, although he was suffering from heart conditions that weren't detected that could have caused him some stress and some discomfort. The other factor to consider is, were there any psychological conditions he was suffering from at the time, and there were industrial relation problems between the airline and the pilots. He was pro-airline and there was graffiti in the cockpit that was not conducive to a good working environment, and he had an altercation in the briefing room before he took off. So there are lots of factors to consider. The Trident aircraft was a 1950s design. It was a 3-engined, rear-engined aircraft, the T-tail, so the weight of the aircraft was at the back, therefore it made the aircraft quite tricky to fly. You had to follow specific requirements to get the aircraft airborne, maintain speed and cruise. In order to maintain positive climb, i.e. the aircraft taking off at the right speed and angle, they had to achieve something like 245 knots, and also at the same time the leading edge droops were retracted too soon, therefore the aircraft didn't have enough speed or enough lift, and unfortunately it came down.
The inquiry tells us that there was a mixture of reasons for the crash, including mechanical and human factors. The flight data recorder tells us that there were 2 stall warnings that were unfortunately ignored. In the first storm warning, the yokes would have shook violently to alert the crew that there was a problem. It would have sounded much like this. For some reason, this stall warning was switched off and the flight crew were either unable or knew to increase speed or correct the droop position. Then, in a final attempt to avert disaster, a second stall warning, just as loud as the first, occurred. This time, the yokes would have auto-pushed forward as the aircraft tried to self-correct for the lack of airflow to the engines by auto-pitching the nose down to increase lift. This final warning was again ignored and overridden by the crew. With the aircraft pointing nose down and so low to the ground, the flight crew may have panicked. But to pull the nose up now would have put the plane into a fatal deep stall for which there was no recovery. Because of the unique design of the Trident, all of its engines are in the back of the aircraft. But the pitch that the flight crew placed the aircraft in now, in its final moment, placed the engines into a void which all but stopped airflow to the engines and tail. Even if they wanted to correct the pitch of the aircraft at this stage, now they couldn't. The elevators that control the pitch were in the tail as well. Perhaps Captain Key was partly incapacitated due to chest pains. He would have been experiencing some level of difficulty. Maybe not a heart attack, but was his capability too impaired to correct the problems in the cockpit as they occurred? We also know that the atmosphere in the cockpit may have been toxic, with Key potentially still reeling from the altercation earlier that day, and witnessed by at least one of the other junior crew members sat next to him. Is it possible that the junior officers in the cockpit felt too intimidated to step in and correct the errors as they occurred? We've seen what the droops do. They provide extra lift during takeoff. 2 years earlier, in 1970, a Naples-bound Trident Foxtrot Hotel experienced a malfunction of their droop lever. An earlier version of the Trident, the droops had also retracted, but without human interference. Of the event, First Officer Schofield tells us of his experience at only 1,000 feet off the ground.
When flaps selected up after takeoff, the stick shaker, followed by the stick pusher, operated. Disconnected the autopilot and built the speed up to 200 knots. Found that the droop had retracted and the droop lever was in the forward position. Droop lowered again and service continued to Naples.
Various experiments followed this event to try and reproduce the malfunction, but all without success. The inquiry report suggests a manner of things that could have occurred, including human error, as the reason the droops were retracted. However, these are all assumptions. The data recorder from the Papa India flight tells us what's happened, but without a cockpit voice recorder, which was not standard across commercial flights at the time, we will never know for sure why the plane crashed.
Maintain 100 and reach your good day.
Five men who were arrested yesterday at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel and office were found to be armed with photographic and recording equipment. The arrests take place at the height of the re-election campaign of Republican President Richard Nixon. Closer to home, the bitter dispute between worker and worker is still ongoing in the crisis at the nation's docks as the 4-year row continues over container cargoes. This week, the Industrial Relations Act has played its part, and now an unofficial national dock strike will bring matters to an end.
What I remember happening on that day, I was on patrol. I was designated to patrol the A30 on Kilo 2. That's a traffic car we patrolled from the Bagshot area, Camberley, Bagshot, all the way down to Egham through Ascot. And I was working with a chap called Laurie Hercombe. Sadly, he's now passed. But he was a very professional chap, and we were dealing with a lady whose car had broken down. Well, not actually broken down, but had got a flat tyre. We were sent to assist her, and she'd torn all the tops of her fingers off. It was like a Triumph Heralder from what I remember, and she'd tried to pull the wheel hub off to get the brace to undo the nuts, and so she was quite seriously hurt on the ends of her fingers, not life-threatening or anything. So we were starting to help her. We'd called an ambulance, we'd jacked the car up, and over the radio again we got this other call that came out saying that there was possibly a light aircraft that had crashed in Staines near the gasometer. So Laurie, being professional, said to the lady, the ambulance is on its way, your wheel's been done, we're leaving you. So which we did. We drove all the way down to what was then known as the Victoria RA, the Victoria Roundabout, just at the bottom of Egham Hill, which is probably now known as the Runnymede Roundabout. Traffic was quite busy. We drove up the A30 towards the Crooked Billet, turned round the roundabout because that was the Met area and we were Surrey, and back down to the roundabout again, which we had already come from. There was radio traffic communications, and we were then told it wasn't a light aircraft, it was possibly a passenger aircraft. We drove up the A30 again towards the Crooked Billet. As we were waiting to go round the roundabout, somebody was in the pub. They were drinking outside on tables, shouted, "Are you looking for an aeroplane that's landed?" We sort of said yes, and he pointed in the direction where he said he'd seen this plane go. We went round the roundabout and back down the other side again. And when we got there, there was already now an airport fire engine, and one of my other colleagues from traffic, Kilo 1 car, was there with the fire engine. Laurie, my mate, said, "We're not stopping here, we're going to stop the traffic back at the Victoria Roundabout." So we continued down towards the Surrey border again and blocked the roundabout, doing traffic duty so that it would leave the dual carriageways free for emergency ambulances, fire brigade, all sorts. So we blocked it, and we then controlled traffic that was only urgent traffic that could get up the motorway to deal with the actual accident.
I was on duty at Chertsey Ambulance Station on the afternoon shift, starting at 3, finishing at 11. And before we went to the Trident air disaster, we did 2 calls. We went out to an elderly lady who fell and broke her hip. We just booked available at St Peter's Hospital at Chertsey and were told to head towards Staines because there was a report of a possible light aircraft crash. About 2 or 3 minutes later, I heard the crew on scene calling up and saying, "This is not a light aircraft, this is a major disaster, we need all the help we can get." I paraphrase. And then we got rerouted to a road accident in Addlestone, where there was a young lad who'd been knocked down and everybody was making a huge fuss, and in fact all he'd got was minor grazes. So we whipped him into St Peter's Hospital at Chertsey and then went towards the incident. What I do remember was, as I was attempting to get through the traffic in Egham, the roads were absolutely gridlocked, and at one point we actually had to drive across a roundabout, and it was so bad we actually had to get out of the ambulance and ask people to move their cars in order we could get to the scene. When I arrived on the scene, we were probably about the 15th ambulance to be there, and we were directed into the parking point.
Brian playing with his dog. Yeah. I call him my granddog. Overcast Sunday afternoon. Warm. Bit of rain on a Sunday. 18th of June 1972. About 4:30. Having tea with some friends and their family. My wife and I and our little one, waiting for the joy of a second birth within 3 or 4 weeks. It was particularly a happy time because of our baby coming and our little one, and I'd just passed my police inspector's exam, and then suddenly the phone rings, and the phone often rings. But I didn't know that this day, when it rang, would be very different from any other phone call that I might ever take. And the operator, a police officer from Staines Police Station, said, "You've got to get on duty. There's been a plane crash." I said, "A plane crash?" And I immediately thought a light aircraft for some reason, almost like a little paper plane. I didn't realise the significance of a jet airliner, as it turned out to be, crashing just after takeoff. So I did that I was told to do, because that was it. You direct to duty. I said, "I haven't got any." What they said, "What uniform have you got?" I said, "Very little. I got my uniform, my sergeant's stripes on, blue trousers. I haven't got any police boots. I've got a pair of black shoes. Got no hat. I've got a shirt and a tie." "Oh, don't worry about that. Just get yourself down here." And it was, as far as I remember, it was quite mayhem down there, albeit it's a small police station. Lots of policemen running about, and lots of happening. And it then seemed to me that the world and his wife, Sunday afternoon, you wouldn't expect a lot of people about in those days, but you saw 2 or 3 people almost running from all directions, and almost like as if a circus had turned up in town. And then reality pitched in, because the aeroplane had crashed 200 yards from the police station, due north of the Staines Police Station. And you could run up the alleyway, and as far as I remember, it was like a caravanette or caravan centre on the right. It's almost like a dirt track, and you actually ran into a meadow with the pylons there. The aircraft crashed.
Okie-doke.
Well, it was a Sunday afternoon. It was coming towards the end of our shift, and then we got this call to go to the Staines bypass. Aircraft crash. I was on Delta 27 Heston's emergency tender, London Fire Brigade, and we pulled into the lay-by on the Staines bypass, just past the Crooked Billet, which was a public house at the time. Pulled over to the left. Our officer in charge was Brian. He said, "Stay where you are, lads. I will go and investigate." He came back a few minutes later to say there's an aircraft crashed in the field here. And we all made our way through, and it was a terrible situation.
And the message came through quite quickly from the incident managers that there was nobody left who was alive. So our job basically went from being ready to go in and do what we could to sadly just having to transport all the victims to Heathrow Airport, where a temporary mortuary had been set up.
You got a quick look at it, you could see the almost vapour coming off it, the stench of kerosene. You could see that the tower was embedded very deeply into the earth. A quick look at it was probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 feet crater. You could see the main fuselage broken up and seemed to have bounced forward. On the front of that, you had the flight deck, which was like a crumpled heap, but big enough to know that was the nose of the aircraft. And obviously you think, well, there might be the crew in there. As it turned out, they were. Captain Key, Simon Ticehurst, Jeremy Keithley.
Whilst we were waiting for these souls to be extricated from the aircraft, and we were standing around waiting, was that after we'd been there for some time, a fire broke out. The aircraft caught fire, and that's one of the rare occasions I've seen people from the emergency services actually running, and the firefighters very bravely stood their ground and extinguished the fire.
2 or 3 lots of fire, but it didn't go up like a fireball. It broke out like a chimney on fire at times, and there were pockets.
Fire did break out when BAA were cutting, but it was extinguished quite quickly, and it didn't cause too much of a problem.
And then as you looked around, it was obvious to me that many people were dead, having had catastrophic injuries, particularly to their lower limbs. Then fires broke out, as I say. And then as you're looking around, you're thinking, well, you feel a bit hopeless. Helpless because there's not much you can do. It's clear they're all dead. Except that, you know, there was one, an Irish gentleman, I think was pulled from the wreckage and lived 3 or 4 hours, went to Ashford Hospital.
But we'd done our utmost with dignity, and my job with another colleague was to lift the casualties out of the aircraft with dignity, so that you know, it was a bad afternoon, but we'd done our utmost to get the people out of the aircraft.
And then sadly, one by one, the victims were brought out, placed into our ambulances, and we took them up to the mortuary at Heathrow.
But you could see the devastation. You could feel it in all of us. All those poor souls dead. Shocking. But you still had to carry on for what you were trained to do. In this case, it was to save life. But there wasn't any life to save.
When I resumed back to work, of course, there was the sad business of removing wreckage from the fields. And they were fields in those days. It was the old waterworks area. We knew it as the waterworks area. And we were involved, various of us, in escorting parts of the aircraft being taken back to on special transporters, where they apparently rebuilt it all to try to find out what they could as the cause of the crash.
I think it was possibly a day or so later. I was there still on duty, as many of us were, for hour upon hour. And And I can't remember whether it was days on end or 2 or 3 days, 4 days. But they extracted their bodies from the flight deck, which took some action. But apart from that, you had all the little creatures around the crash scene and beyond. There were rabbits, mice, lots of little creatures dead. You still had to carry on for what you were trained to do. In this case, it was to save life. But there wasn't any life to save. So then you keep order, and you keep bad people away.
The crash is not without controversy. The traffic jams along the A30 were noted by one senior politician at the time. Meet local musician Mark Ward, who tells us a shocking story about his walk home from school on the Monday following the crash.
All I remember is that they're saying there was a plane crash. We walked down off the Woodford Road, went to this old Victorian school up there, and we was going home to the council estate just round the corner, and the kids said, come on, and they wanted to go down here. I went, where do you want to go? They went, to the plane crash, and they said, well, there's gold watches, coins, everything, just there for the taking, like, you know. And I went, oh no, that doesn't sound right. And you know, my parents were really like full of moral values and strong moral compass. And I just said, no, not for me. And you know, that moral compass sort of leaped onto me, and you know, it just didn't sound right. And I remember going home telling my mum, she was almost crying when I told her what their kids were up to. I went off down the council estate and they went off down here. People didn't have much money in them days, but you don't do that, do you, you know?
Several residents have been in contact to explain that there were also people there who wanted to help. I've heard stories of residents bringing blankets and making cups of tea for the emergency responders. The report also vindicated the drivers along the A30 and confirms that, albeit the roads were busy, the local traffic did not impede emergency services on site, and therefore spectators did not affect rescue services. If Heseltine was right that there were ghouls present on that day, then they certainly weren't all ghouls.
All of this happened a stone's throw from where I'm standing, right here in this neighbourhood. Nigel and Brian were right though. Back in the 70s, the Moormead estate did not exist, and where I'm standing was indeed fields and meadows. So where exactly did the crash occur? I can tell you one thing, it didn't happen where the memorial plaque is. To find its exact location, we have to do some digging.
An iconic element made famous by press photography at the time of the Papa India air crash is the electricity pylon behind the tail of the Trident. Using the pylon and tail image, we can work out a line of sight using the 2 points to get an exact location for the tail. But first, we need to better understand what the crossbars are doing on the pylon to replicate the line of sight. If we digitally enhance what the crossbars are doing, then we can get a better analysis of the skewed angle of the pylon. And therefore we can approximate where the photographer was at the time of the photograph to work out where the tail was. Using a plan orientation of the area, we can try to match up the photographer's view of the pylon with a local view from a nearby alleyway. The yellow line represents a corner-to-corner match of the pylon, but we know that the view of the pylon is not corner-to-corner and is skewed. Taking the skewed view of the pylon into account, we can approximate the line of sight using this red line, confirmed by today's photography, which then allows us to place the tail here.
I'm here right now, just off of Lark Avenue, which is the closest we can get, which means the crash happened
over there. Tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the Papa India crash. As always, local Staines Church St Mary's remembers the dead in a special service. It feels important to remember that this was also an international incident, including crew. On board were 35 Brits, 29 Belgians, 29 Americans, 12 Irish, 4 South Africans, 3 Canadians, 1 French West African, 1 Indian, 1 Jamaican, 1 Latin American, 1 Nigerian and 1 Thai national. It feels important to learn as much as possible about who the 118 were. Of those on board, we know that there were a group of 16 doctors and senior staff from the Royal London Homeopathic Hospital, 12 senior business leaders from Ireland, and a former CIA official. But what were their likes and dislikes? I'd like to find out at least one hobby that our 118 had. 118 lives gone in an instant. Gone, but not forgotten.
When my father died, I was 16. My sister was 18, another sister 19, and I had a younger brother who was 12. So I think it's very important to remember my father. Old Kay, I only knew him for 16 years, but we did a lot together. He was a keen sailor. I became a very keen sailor as a result. We had a lot of good memories from that, but albeit they were over a fairly short period of time, you know. And my mother, she's still alive. She said, "Oh, is it 50 years?" I said, "Yes, it is." You know.
Does it feel like 50 years?
Sometimes it does. Sometimes it feels like yesterday.
I think it's important to remember what happened for a number of reasons. One, for the families of those that sadly died, because for some it's closure, for some it's remembrance, for some it's sadness, for some it just brings back that memory of their loved ones. So that's important. As a community we need to remember, because we in Staines have a very close connection to that accident, as you might imagine. For the aviation industry it's important because some very strong lessons came out of the accident, particularly cockpit voice recorders and the ability to do crew resource management, the interrelationship between members of the crew, which is not just an aviation thing, it's gone on into the health system and even into nuclear power stations. So it's about the community, it's about individuals, it's about improving and learning from things that didn't quite go right.
I felt compelled to be here today as a Staines resident and a Belgian citizen in support of the families of the victims of this terrible crash, and most importantly probably as a flight attendant and a member of the airline industry, because this crash was so important because of the lack of a flight recorder that day, and it's saved, I'm sure, a lot of lives since that crash.
I was here 50 years ago today, and I found today more difficult than just working. On the day you're that busy getting on to do the job you were trained to do as a policeman here, to help these poor souls who've lost their lives, unfortunately.
The only thing, as I say, was a senior police officer saying to me, "Why haven't you got your hat on?" And I said, "Well, I came straight to the scene with what uniform I had." And he just reminded me that you better have your hat on when the next time, and I just reminded him politely. God help us. Let's hope we never have a next time.
Any incident in aviation is always traumatic. Both of those obviously involved, relatives, colleagues, and those who've taken interest in the industry. It's always upsetting when you see something happening. There's recently the crash in Nepal with all lives lost. But every incident, hopefully, there are lessons learned, and it reduces the possibility of that incident occurring in the future.
At the end of my shift, I thought, goodness me, I've got to talk to somebody about this. I'm a teenager, I'm just out of training school. This is my worst possible nightmare. And I went round to my best pal's house who lived in Chertsey, who said, I know what you've come to do. He said, you've come to talk to me about this. He said, I've been watching it on the television. So I sat with him for a couple of hours, had a couple of pints of beer, and then went off home. The extraordinary thing was, though, I was back on duty at 8 o'clock the next morning on overtime, and I think by about the sort of Tuesday or the Wednesday, it wasn't even a discussion point.
In the days when I was a police officer, people weren't trained to come and speak to us, to counsel us. We were expected to deal with our own counselling, and we did do that. With my colleague Laurie Hercombe, we would have then been at the end of a duty. People would discuss what had happened, so you had your own way. And normally you had a good wife or somebody at home too, that if you needed to unload, not everybody did, you could talk to them. But we didn't have counselling as people have today.
But I think we came from a very different generation. We had been brought up by people who, some of them I worked with, had been in the war. And I think this culture of, well, that's the way it is, get on with it, sort of existed.
In those days there was no counselling, so our counselling was done by ourselves.
You know, you're a police officer or you're emergency services. I don't know about the other emergency services, what counselling or what briefing they ever got for trauma and what they witnessed and what they dealt with. But all I knew, whatever I dealt with, and I dealt with lots of death in different forms, both young and old, but no one ever said to me, oh, you must go on a counselling course.
You either did the job and put up with what happened, or you changed departments or changed the job.
Sit round the mess table with a big pot of tea and talk between ourselves, and that was our counselling.
So never did I believe 50 years ago that here I am now still training ambulance paramedics on how to keep themselves safe in the workplace as a result of a lifetime of experience. And occasionally I'm asked by student paramedics who I train, how do we cope with this scenario and that scenario? And I say, well, from my own personal experience, just reflect on the fact that it's been a privilege to be there to help people at a time of crisis. You can only do your best, and that's the way I frame my thinking. And if young paramedic students say to me, what do? I say, that's what you need to do.
Support for officers in those days was self-sufficient in a way. You worked as a group and a team, and you shared things, and normally you didn't often end up at a job solely on your own unless you were very unlucky. But you also knew the fire brigade, you also knew the people the ambulance crews. Because I was traffic, you could often share things with the people on the scene, and it was dealt with. And when you went back to book off for your end of duty, your senior officers, your sergeant, your inspector would say, are you all right? Check that you were okay.
The thing I always remember as a 19-year-old police constable was a lady who drowned, and I had to go to the mortuary to witness the post-mortem. And the officer in charge of the case was a very nice detective inspector. And he said, you don't have to stay if you feel a bit ill. I felt a bit nauseous. But he came to the single men's quarters to look me up about 4 or 5 hours later and asked me how I felt, which I thought was very kind. And I said I was okay. And I was, but that was an individual approach, which was lovely, very nice. I always thought it was a very nice act of kindness from him. But I learned, as you go through, you get exposed to these things, so you always think about your young officers. So in the end, I used to think about all my young constables, sergeants and some of my inspectors. I used to think, well, I treated them like my family.
And of course, always have it in your heart that I'm afraid death and suffering is inevitable. We can't save everybody, but we can certainly have the satisfaction knowing that we were somebody who was there and did our best under very trying circumstances. And that's where the sort of inner peace and resolve comes to get up and continue doing it another day.
Oh look, the memorial kind of looks like a radar.
Yeah, the plaque's in the middle of the radar.
It's like they're found